So let's get into it, Tim. You're the financial planner. Inflation's like your thing, right?
Yeah, well, is it my thing? That's interesting. It certainly has to do with economics and finance. Certainly something as a financial advisor we're trying to plan and prepare for, try to help people insulate themselves from, because inflation really erodes one's purchasing power. So if we're going to define inflation, what exactly is it? Well, it happens when the cost of goods, the things that you buy in the store, so goods and services, increase, resulting in purchasing power of the dollar decreasing. Okay, in English, what that means is if you make $3,000 a month, but your rent goes up by $200 and the gas bill goes up by $200 and groceries goes up by $200, you're now dealing with less disposable income. The cost of goods increases, reducing the purchasing power of your dollar. Your $3,000 income simply does not go as far as it once did. Now, you can go back to episode 43 in our back catalog and learn more about inflation. I'd encourage you to take a look at that. But really, inflation is a kind of a tax. It's an invisible tax on everyone. And in that way, it's what's called a regressive tax. So in tax language, there are progressive taxes and there are regressive taxes. Progressive taxes are taxes which are graduated, like our tax system. It's 10% for the first $10,000 and 15% after that. And every marginal bracket you go up, your tax rate goes marginally higher. That's a progressive thing. It progresses higher the more you make. However, that's not how inflation works. It is a kind of a tax, and I'm going to explain that in a minute, but it's a regressive tax because it affects those on the lower end of the income scale more profoundly than it does affect those on the higher end of the income scale. Okay, so that's really interesting. How is it a tax? Let me explain. It's a tax because inflation is caused when the government, oftentimes it's the government, there are sometimes some other factors, but usually it's by the government stepping in and trying to manipulate or influence a market or an economy in a given way. One of the most recent ways that we've seen inflation come to bear is through the COVID crisis responses. If you look at something called money supply is simply how many dollars are out there in bank accounts that are liquid and available and able to be used for purchasing goods and services. The money supply during COVID nearly doubled. The amount of dollars in our economy shot up dramatically as the government's way of trying to help buffer our economy from the worst effects of the COVID crisis, the lockdowns, the draconian measures that they put in place to try to protect everyone's life and sanity. It was a terrible idea back then, and now we're reaping the terrible effects of that really awful policy, which is a tax. That instead of just taxing us more to be able to provide more cash to our economy, they just invent more money. Literally, someone in the Fed goes to a terminal and invents new dollars, adds a couple zeros at the end of the Fed's bank account, and they inject that money into our system. They inject it onto the balance sheets of banks. When they do that, they're increasing the money supply. They're increasing the number of dollars chasing the same amount of goods. When the number of dollars increases, but the amount of goods or services do not, what happens is that the cost of those goods and services rises to the level of how much we have for our money supply, how much money is actually available to buy those goods. So it is a form of tax. And this is the thing. The most progressive people on our political spectrum are the ones who want to tax the rich. They want to make the rich pay their fair share, but their policies create the most regressive tax, the one that affects the poor the most. And then their policies, in response to let's help the poor, is to increase taxes and to cause more government spending when we don't have enough tax revenue base to support the taxes we're already, the benefits we're paying. That causes even more inflation. It's a hidden tax. The left is essentially destroying our lower income, poor population through their influence of inflation. So, yeah, you may be able to sense my political leanings here. I am very much opposed to government spending that results in borrowing money or inventing new dollars, which causes inflation.
That's really interesting. So how is this inflation thing measured? And is inflation a good or a bad thing? Because we've talked in the past how the Fed tries to keep inflation at a certain number, right? So can you talk about
they
that?
say.
Yeah,
2% is what they say.
Well, that number changes from time to time. The Fed sets a goal.
Yeah.
Their goal is 2% or 3% or whatever the right number they feel is. And the way they measure inflation is something called the Consumer Price Index or the Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index. These are different ways of measuring, are things that we're buying and using, are they getting more expensive or less expensive? So if you go and just Google CPI or Consumer Price Index, you'll find the website from the government, which actually breaks it down, and you can see how much of it comes from this sector of our spending or that sector of our spending. So what happens really is the government's doing a survey, and every month they're going out and they're saying, how much does a carton of milk cost, or a dozen eggs? How about a steak or ground beef? Or what about what does it cost to, get your taxes done?
Gallon of gasoline.
Right. All of those things are rent. Housing is a big part of it. That's actually been recently, that's been the biggest cause of inflation is the increased cost of housing. So that's a major factor. Add all those things up, and then we take that number, compare it to last month's number, and is inflation higher or lower? That's all they're doing. And actually, they don't look at it. They look at it from month to month, but they look at it as a rolling 12 months. They said, based on
year
this
over
month's
year.
Year over year. Based on this month's number, year over year, we're up 4%, we're up 5%, we're up 2%, whatever the number happens to be. Okay? So different measures, Consumer Price Index or the Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index. That's a mouthful. The PCEPI. Doesn't roll off the tongue like CPI.
Does not.
No.
But Tyler then asks a question, again, coming back to your economics mind, is inflation good or bad? What are your thoughts on that, Tim?
I think on its base level, inflation destroys wealth, potentially, if we're not positioning ourselves well and properly. We don't like deflation. Deflation is bad. Massive inflation is bad. Moderate to low inflation over a long period of time is not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, what it indicates is there's some amount of expansion of goods and services.
But what would be a long period of time in your mind or the government's mind?
So we want stable inflation at a low level for a long period of time, which would be like 10, 20 years. You don't want big spikes and big swings in inflation. We don't want inflation to be 2% this year, 10% next year, -5 the following year, up 7 the next year. Like, there's no way for businesses to predict and to price and to pay employees the appropriate amount of salary. Right? That becomes very difficult for businesses to plan. And the government doesn't like to hear this, perhaps. But our economy runs not because the government gives it permission. Our economy runs because businesses are getting out there and getting it done, providing services and products that people actually want and need. So the more difficult you make businesses to be profitable, businesses to predict the future, businesses to control their expenses, the more chaotic, the less productive our economy is, the lower our gross domestic product becomes, which is the measurement of how productive we are as a nation, which results in the poorer we are as a nation. And when we're all poor, that's equal, but that's not good.